Cars, laptops, gaming devices, medical equipment, washing machines, and LED light bulbs all have one thing in common. This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. You ever ask yourself how everything got so smart? Not people, obviously, but like things. Smartphones, smart fridge, smart car. It's because these days, cars, laptops, gaming devices, medical equipment, washing machines, and LED light bulbs all have one thing in common: a semiconductor chip. While some of those chips are as small as a strand of hair, the demand for them is pretty huge. And right now, the US doesn't really have the supply to keep up with it all. Tonight, we're digging into the shortages around this tiny piece of technology and why you should care about it. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a semiconductor chip? Without getting too technical, think of it as an adapter of sorts. Basically, it's the connecting piece that helps chips do the jobs they're assigned to. Sometimes that's helping with processing power. Other times it's memory. But in almost every case, they are essential in actually making a device or equipment work.
The amount of data they are generating, that requires chips to generate the data, chips to move the data, and chips to store the data. Since 2014, the data has been increasing twice every 2 years.
As is the motto with most things in tech and computing power these days, the smaller and faster, the better. And these things can get pretty dang small. So how is the shortage impacting certain products? Well, if you know basic economics, low supply and high demand equal higher prices for the consumer. AKA, your new phone might cost you a little bit more. But it's also forcing some industries to scale back production of items and in some cases, straight up shut down. That's what's happened to Ford plants in Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio.
I was in a market for a particular kind of a car. I've been told that I'm going to get it in March of next year. And that's because of the shortage.
New cars are basically part computer. The screen to play your music and see the backup camera, the keyless start, etc. Those cars need those chips to make a lot of that happen. According to the Detroit Free Press, car dealers around the country are so desperate for inventory, Ford Motor Company might even start shipping unchipped vehicles later this year to help fill the empty car lots. They wouldn't be able to be sold to consumers right away, but once the semiconductor chip supply is back up and running, the install would be pretty easy. So where did this shortage come from? Add it to the list of things to blame on COVID, at least partially.
There was a sudden increase in demand for laptops, PCs, tablets, right? So there goes your demand up for semiconductors.
But some of it also has to do with US trade sanctions on China.
As a result of that, what was happening was US had put a few Chinese companies on an entity list, and they could not procure semiconductor devices after a certain point of time. So whatever time was available, they gave big orders to the semiconductor foundries and piled up a lot of inventory, which kept the semiconductor foundries extremely busy.
Then there's also the fact that there's just not enough factories to keep up with the demand of these chips.
If you look at it, there are very few companies who actually make the chips. So it's not like widgets that anybody can make.
So now that you have a little background, you're probably wondering, why can't we just make more factories and produce a bunch of these to make up for the shortage? To answer that question, we're turning to Newsy's Tyler Adkisson.
Correcting the semiconductor shortage can't be done with a short-term fix. Between high production costs and long lead times, increasing chip supply isn't as easy as building more production facilities.
And, for the last 40 years, the semiconductor industry has been known for, wild shortages and wild oversupply. You can't really build a small factory, so you got to build this mega factory.
Semiconductor fabrication plants, also known as fabs or foundries, take billions of dollars and years to construct. Designing and constructing chip parts, known as wafers, is a months-long process that includes heating silica sand to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
The more complicated the product is, the longer it's in the factory. So this is like a photography process, and that wafer will go through the factory dozens of times.
There are two parts to it, right? Fab is like your bakery. Let's cut through in a simple manner, it's a bakery. You have a lot of orders coming in. You're making cookies, you're making cakes, you're making, I don't know, empanadas. I don't know if they are made like that. But, the point is you can't just very on a whim change it. And by the way, this whole process, as I said, it takes about 4 months for the whole wafer to become what is usable as a die.
The fabs are also complex. They require specialized multi-million-dollar machines to make semiconductors and enclosed dust-free rooms to make chips. The US is trying to boost its supply chain. In February, President Joe Biden signed an executive order to review policy recommendations to bolster semiconductor production. Several major semiconductor producers, like the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, are also investing in new US fabs.
TSMC has announced something in Arizona, and it's already broken ground for that. Intel is expanding in Arizona. But those announcements were just made. Factories have started building in 2021. So the production isn't really expected before 24.
But shoring up semiconductor supply will require the US to diversify where it is importing chips from. That will also take some geopolitical navigating.
Now, with these few minimal fabs coming up, this will basically help US to retain its worldwide production percentage, right? So the production percentage from US is about 11 to 12%. With these limited new foundries, the capacity addition would just help it retain or maybe add a percentage point or so.
I don't see a competition kind of an environment where everybody sings kumbaya. That's why if you look around, we only talk about US, Taiwan, China, Korea, Japan a little bit. India is getting into the mix. European Union is getting aggressively into the mix. I mean, pretty much everybody knows the importance of it.
Tyler Adkison, Newsy, Chicago.
Here to talk to us a bit more about these shortages is Newsy's Tyler Adkison. Tyler, we like to think of ourselves as a solutions-oriented organization. I have to ask, can we just import more semiconductors? Is that an option?
If it was, I think we wouldn't even be talking right now.
Right.
The issue with the issue with semiconductors is that, they take months to make. You have to really think well far in advance about what kind of, semiconductors you're going to need for devices. If you're looking to put an iPhone out 2 years in advance, you really have to start thinking about what capabilities the chips you have right now have and what you're going to need down the line. In a lot of instances, it's not necessarily in a company's best interest to just be stockpiling computer chips, because in a lot of cases, especially for more advanced devices, all the chips need to be specially designed for the product that they're going to be put into. You can't just one day, if you're making computer chips for a car factory, say, okay, now we're just going to start supplying them for Nintendo Switches or a PS5 or something like that. Really, the issue comes down to the fact that these are really kind of complicated devices to make. You need technical machinery, and, quite frankly, we're kind of at capacity of what we can do right now. And as more and more devices start utilizing semiconductors within their own things, like if you have a air conditioner that's computerized or something, they're going to require it too. So, it's not just that the automotive industry really needs to find more ways to get chips. It's that every industry is going to be better off if they can figure out ways to make sure there's a more sure supply at hand.
I'm glad you mentioned the automotive industry. We know that they are set to lose hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm curious to know, are there any other industries that have been really hard hit by this shortage?
One way that we can sort of look at this is Goldman Sachs did an analysis recently where they looked into how many different industries would be severely impacted by a semiconductor shortage. And what they found was that there was 169 different industries that fell within that list. Now, the way that they figured out who ended up in that list of 169 people was looking at basically what industries spend more than 1% of their total GDP on semiconductors. And the semiconductor industry is a $500 billion industry. It's up there with oil and some of these other places too. And as, like I said before, as devices get more computerized, as things become more electronic, more and more industries are going to start relying on these semiconductors. So it's not just an issue of that you might not be able to buy, the kind of phone that you want, or it might be more expensive. It's that underlying a lot of our society is semiconductors, and you may not see it because, well, they're kind of small, but also, they really are becoming a part of every industry at this point.
It's funny in talking to you about this and in looking over some of your research, they are everywhere, right? And I think to myself, there have to be Smart people, really smart people, smarter than you even, smart people out there really working to build a replacement. Are there any replacements for semiconductors in this, in this time period where there's a shortage?
No. The thing is that these, I mean, it's just as simple as that. No. These are, state of the art. Think about 30 years ago, how many devices you had in your household or around that really relied on computerized technology at this point. These devices are relatively new, and right now you can't necessarily just replace a semiconductor with something else right there. It's just kind of an underlying fact that the way that our society works requires lots and lots of semiconductors at this point. And if there was alternatives out there, I don't think that we would really have this problem. But one thing that may help moving forward, based on what I've talked to some experts about, is the use of artificial intelligence in this space. Eventually when we get more computerized ways to streamline supply and demand and even help with chip design and things like that, we may see these chips end up becoming even more efficient over time, and that may end up solving the issue. But right now there's not really a one-to-one replacement. If you have a product that needs a semiconductor, it needs a semiconductor.
Straight and to the point, Tyler Atkinson. It's always a great time when you're here. Thanks so much for your expertise, man. We'll do this again sometime.
Happy to do it.
The most decorated American gymnast of all time has put a renewed spotlight on mental health in elite sports.